All right, so it's 3 p.m. and we are all set to begin with our today's webinar. A very warm welcome to all our participants present here today. The Abeline paradox is a scenario in which a group of people collectively decide on a course of action that is counter to the preferences of any of the individuals in the group. It involves a common breakdown of group communication in which each member mistakenly believes that their own preference are counter to the group's and therefore does not raise objections. Our personal fears of being seen as different, more so than actual pressure from the group, causes this response. Unfortunately, the don't rock the boat approach to decision management often stifles honest opinions and valid concerns. When silence contributes to poor decisions, what often results are precisely those conditions that prompted the silence in the first place: failure and ultimate separation from the group. HR Association of India welcomes you all to the 2022 Dialogue Masterclass series on the topic Abilene Paradox at Work. To know more about HRAI and its events, I would request all our participants to visit the link and details posted in the chat window. Request all the participants to kindly follow the webinar guidelines mentioned in the chat window. It would be great to have all the participants' feedback. We will be running a poll before the Q&A session. Request all participants to kindly give your feedback on the session. I now take the privilege to introduce our esteemed speaker for today, Ms. Harini Srinivasan, partner, Samcostal Institute, India. A pharmacist turned HR leader, Harini comes with a master's degree in the medicinal chemistry and a master's in business administration, human resources, a behavioral scientist and certified practitioner of various methods. She is adept in unlocking human potential in organizations. She has 27 years of successful experiments in the areas of leveraging people potential for business excellence. A master storyteller and a strong believer in driving one's destiny, she practices resilience as a life skill. Positivity and ability to drive engagement with people helps her be an influencer both to industry and academia. Currently, she is a partner with Sam Costile Institute India and a behavioral science advisor to personify. She is also a TEDx speaker and a visiting faculty at universities and Tier 1 P schools in India, and is mentoring dozens of students and professionals across the country. You can follow her on LinkedIn. The link for the same has been shared in the chat window. Without wasting much time, I now hand over the platform to Ms. Harini Srinivasan. Over to you, Ms. Harini.
Thank you so much, Faisal, and happy to be back on this masterclass series. And I think, as usual, I'm the first speaker in this season as well. So happy to be back. And although this was short notice, I think we have a decent turnout. I see a lot of familiar names and extremely eager to hear from every one of you during this. So please be participative. And as always, I am not going to be using a PowerPoint presentation because the topic here is such that one doesn't need a PPT at all. So we're going to walk through Abilene paradoxes at work. And we're going to, of course, there has to be a takeaway. So we're going to take away certain learnings from our experiences of dealing with Abilene paradox at work. So there's a very interesting story of the Abilene paradox, which most of you, I'm sure, would have read by now. So I'm not going to tell that story right up front, but if anybody's interested, we'll keep that for the end. But let me bring to your memory, at least people of my generation would definitely know, there was this movie called Ek Ruka Hua Faisla. It's an iconic movie. I think it was released somewhere in the late 1980s. K.K. Raina starrer, an iconic movie, and it has been shown, excerpt of that movie has been shown in a lot of management programs. There are huge takeaways from that movie. And people who have seen it would know, but those who have not, I'll give you an overview. So in this movie, there is a young chap who is actually being tried for murder of his father. And all evidences apparently are against him. And finally, the case is handed over to a jury of 12 jurors, and they are confined to a room, and they have to debate, and they have to come with the decision about what his fate would be. Now, out of the 12 jurors, 11 of them, they want to just quickly finish off this case, and they say that yes, he is accused of murder, and whatever is the punishment that has to be meted out to him. This one person who does not believe that this guy is the murderer, and he puts all his effort to change those 11 minds to his direction. So what this the juror number 8, which was actually played by KK Rana, what he did in that movie was how he actually broke the Abilene paradox. Now, we have lots of examples about how Abilene paradox occurs at the workplace, but this movie I thought is a good start for us to talk about, because on a very positive note, this movie is a classic example of how Abilene paradox was broken. So I wanted to start in reverse order, which is my usual style. So that's why I brought this story up front. But let me go back to some of my real experiences of Abilene Paradox. And let me bring my favorite character, Anamika, here. Otherwise, this would be incomplete. So Anamika was working in an organization where they were thinking about whether it has to be an 8-hour workday, or it has to be an 8.5 hours workday with a half an hour of lunch or 1 hour of lunch. So that, and she was having this meeting with a whole lot of people, all stakeholders, and they wanted to come up with this decision whether it should be 8 hours plus half an hour of lunch, or 8.5 hours plus, I mean, including 1 hour of lunch. Small thing, but made huge differences, because in a city like Mumbai, there are people who travel long distances. You have traffic constraints, you have problems with the weather, so on and so forth. So there are going to be different opinions. And what she noticed is that everybody started saying that, yeah, I think we should do what's convenient, and let's shift to an 8.5 hours day with a 1 hour lunch break. Let's start early. So one person said that, and very quickly the whole group, including managers, project managers, a few employee representatives, HR folks, senior management, a group of around 10, 12 people, everybody agreed to it. And then they went ahead and they started implementing this 9 hours, 8.5 hours workday. And what they discovered is within a week's time, they found that everybody was grumbling about it. People were not able to reach on time. They were stuck in traffic when they were going back home. And there were a lot of conversations around what a bad decision this was. So when this group reassembled, they started wondering. And then Anamika said that, Mr. ABC, you're the one who brought this up. So what's your view on it? So the first person who gave this idea, he said, no, I felt that made sense to everybody, and that's why I proposed. But honestly, I was also not very sure. And then when she went around asking everybody, it turned out that nobody was really in favor of 8.5 hours day. And they were all in favor of an 8-hour day with a half-hour lunch break, because you're actually saving on the commute time. So what happened is everybody agreed on something which nobody agreed upon. And that's why this is a paradox, right? So here, what actually happened, really wanted this, but no one in the group actually voiced out their opinion against why they do not want it. There could be several reasons, and that's what we're going to analyze in the next few minutes. But what a paradox, isn't it? No one wanted it, but agreed on something, the group disagrees actually. So in management parlance, we talk a lot about managing conflicts, right? We talk a lot about managing conflicts. And here, when the Abeline paradox is at work, what we have to do is actually manage agreements. Sometimes agreements could be counterproductive. And that's why we're saying that disagreements are better. Disagreements lead to disruptions. So when you're having an Abilene paradox trap, that kind of agreement is something which leads to a greater amount of frustration, because nobody in the group that took the decision actually is for the decision. Now, this is very interesting, isn't it? So I'm sure all of you, when you look back and reflect on situations at work, you would notice Abilene paradoxes. Okay. So to make it a little more easier for you to understand, let me also pick up another example. So I had this batchmate of mine whom I met after a long time, and we happened to meet around her birthday. And I just decided that I asked her that why don't we go to a Japanese restaurant? It's a new one which is opened recently. Why don't we go to a Japanese restaurant? And I'm sure you like it. So we gathered a couple of more batchmates and we went over there. And it was a mediocre meal, I must admit. And we weren't really excited about the whole thing. The meal literally left a bad taste in our mouths. At the end of it, when we were going back home, uh, my friend said that, was it a bad decision for us to have lunch at this place? The others also said, well, actually, it looks like it was a bad decision. In fact, I was not for it either. I thought a simple pav bhaji at a typical college joint would have been better. We would have gone back and been nostalgic about things. And finally, when it was my turn, again, I felt that, well, I thought a Japanese meal would interest you, and that's why I proposed. But honestly, I'm also not for it. So what happened is, what could have been a great day, a great time spent together, because of the Abilene paradox which slipped into our conversations, turned out to be extremely frustrating for all of us. At the end of it, no one was happy. Now reflect on things that have happened in the past. Look at your organization, look at your workspace, look at things that happen in your personal life, and you will notice Abilene paradox notoriously slipping in. So having said that, I think we must move on to find out, how do you identify if Abilene paradox is very active in your organization or in your teams? Okay, let's keep the personal life out for the moment, but let's look at Abilene paradoxes at work, because that's what we're talking about. And it's very important for all of us to learn to manage agreements. Managing disagreements is somewhat easy. You have to take a side, but managing agreements is, there are no two sides. So how do you do that? So first of all, the very first step is understand where Abilene paradox is at play. Where are you actually noticing it? Look at your group meetings. Okay, whenever there is a decision that needs to be taken, if you notice that people are ready to take a decision only as a group, then you know that Abilene paradox is likely to slip in. When you talk to them one-on-one, they would say their personal opinion, but when you bring them into a group, they would give typical answers like whatever the group feels right. Then you know that Abilene paradox is likely to slip in. Many a time you might notice that people are very quiet when it comes to decision making in a group, and they will respond only when you prompt them to respond. Then you know that there is a possibility that Abilene paradox can slip in. Sometimes, if the group leader is quite autocratic or dictatorial, and people fear voicing their opinion, you can be very sure that an Abilene paradox can slip in. So when you notice Abilene paradox situations, what you can expect as an outcome is, of course, it can be frustrating for everyone, because ultimately everyone has taken a decision which is against what they want. So obviously one of the outcomes is that the whole thing becomes a flop, the initiative becomes a flop, and the Abilene paradox comes out very victoriously, making everybody more frustrated than ever. That's definitely one outcome. The second outcome of Abilene paradox is that people tend to lose their individuality when it comes to thinking. They don't put their point forward. When Abilene paradox becomes a habit, when that becomes a part of your DNA in your teams, you will notice that people are refusing to put forward their points. So you know what happens when people are refusing to put forward their viewpoint? It actually is counterproductive to your concept of diversity. Diversity and inclusion is not merely numbers of how many people, how many diverse people you have in the organization. The whole idea of diversity and inclusion is to have diversity of ideas, diversity of perspectives. But if Abilene paradox is something that happens in your organization, the diversity of perspectives gets killed over a period of time. Then your diversity and inclusion numbers just remain numbers on your dashboards. They don't really mean anything. That's one outcome. Another outcome of the Abilene paradox when it becomes prevalent is your organization or your team can slowly lose its ability to ideate and innovate. Because ideation and innovation are something which get kindled by a lot of individualistic thinking. When people think as individuals, they process the problem statement as individuals, looking at it from their perspective, not getting influenced by what other people think. That's when disruptive ideas are put forth. So if an Abilene paradox is consistently occurring in your teams, if that's part of your culture, then you can be assured that your organization is deviating away from ideation and innovation. So if you're an organization that is trying to build and drive an innovative culture, you have to be very conscious and pick up the Abilene paradoxes that you notice in your workplaces. So when it comes to decision making in teams, I think it makes a lot of sense for you to curiously observe where and how people behave in those rooms. So I was talking about the Abilene paradox to a friend of mine, and we had this conversation as to how is Abilene paradox, is it the same as or is it different from group thinking? It was a very interesting conversation, right? So the symptoms look very similar, right? The manifestation looks very similar. In group thinking, what happens is people are to align with each other. There is a very high sense of conformity, right? And the group starts thinking as a whole without any individual disruptive or dissonant ideas coming out. Abilene paradox also is pretty much the same. But there is one subtle difference between Abilene paradox and group thinking. And although the difference is subtle, the manifestation of that difference could be huge. In group thinking, what happens is conformity is the only thing. If one person is completely convinced about it and has a complete know-how of what the consequences will be, and if there is group thinking, it still doesn't matter because that one person agrees on that way forward. But in Abilene paradox, even the person who's proposing it is proposing, right? So the person who is proposing that solution is also frustrated at the end of it. What happened in the case of Anamika and when they were deciding the number of hours of working in a day, and what happened in my case when I suggested a Japanese restaurant to my friend. The person who suggested was also unhappy with it, and that led to the frustration getting doubled. So that's the difference between group thinking and Abilene paradox. The difference is very subtle in its manifestation, but the consequences are huge. In group thinking, you still have one advocate for that particular decision. But in Abilene paradox, everybody says, I was actually not for it. And that's a dangerous situation for organizations to be in, and helping Abilene paradox thrive in the organization. Now, what all can we do as leaders to catch Abilene paradox at play and to prevent it from showing its face every now and then? There are very simple steps that we can do as leaders. Whenever you are in a meeting where you have to come up with a group decision, please be aware that human beings do not naturally like to get into conflicts. We all like to be good towards each other. We like to show ourselves in good light to each other because we are social beings. So naturally, in meetings, there will be somebody who is very upfront and loud and bold about the decision or what should be the way forward. Now, whether that person is convinced about it or not, there'll be somebody who's the first to talk about a solution. And when others quickly align with it without coming up with a disruption, you can notice that there is a possibility of Abilene paradox. It could also be group thinking, but you can notice what it is. So what do you do as a leader, somebody who understands Abilene paradox? What do you do as a leader? Very simple. One is build psychological safety in these teams. Okay, so when you are in a decision meeting conversation, you can lay down a social contract where you can tell all the participants in that meeting is that you have to be, so one of the pointers in the social contract, which the group can actually come together and build a social contract, you can tell them about the pitfalls of Abilene paradox, and the group can together come up with a social contract. Some of the points in the social contract could be: analyze the solution that's being put forth, find out the pros and cons of the solution, speak your mind, and if you find a difference of opinion from what you have in mind, ensure that you bring it up. Okay, so some of the rules of this game can be that people should be open to talk about it, to present their point of view if it is different. People should be able to look at it from a different perspective, apply their perspective to it and talk about it, and not necessarily jump into conformity. You might even want to reward some people for bringing out a different perspective. Sometimes that works. If it's a decision, for example, I remember doing this in one situation where I was asking somebody to review an incentive model that was designed. The compensation and benefits team had designed an incentive model, and as an HR group, we also got some of the stakeholders in. I was asking them to review it. And I said, when you're reviewing it, the only condition is that you will critically review it. You will poke holes in this model so that the team that has created this model has enough to talk about it. This is not a meeting to look good, right? So it started off with the foundation that you're expected to poke holes in this concept that's being explained. So people were in their minds, they actually they came with the preparedness that we have to critically review it. So when you critically review things, you're actually telling people to critically review. In fact, you're training their mind to look at it from a critical viewpoint. Naturally, the human brain gets conditioned to looking at it critically, and there is a possibility that a disruptive idea or a point of view can come forth. But if you tell people that we want to review it, it's quite likely that the team members might just say that, okay, let's review it, and it all looks good. So when you're asking people to review it, you're consciously telling them that review it and this needs to pass the review. But when you're telling them that you need to review it critically, this needs to pass your test, you're actually seeding a thought in them to look out for things which are not aligned with them. Please remember, conformity is an extremely dangerous situation to be, especially when you are taking critical decisions. Conformity can take the whole group in a completely wrong direction, and you might end up doing a completely unacceptable situation. Okay, you might end up doing a completely unacceptable solution for that situation. So it's important for you to be aware that take a break, take a stop somewhere, invite people to give their point of view, share that point of view, encourage debates, let people learn to debate about it. Obviously, the debate should be healthy, it should be constructive, it should be towards the solution that we are trying to achieve. It should not be disruption for the sake of disruption, right? It should be disruption which leads into a productive, constructive situation, right? So that is something that you have to encourage people to do, so that you're avoiding group thinking and Abilene paradox. Right? So I'll take a pause here, and I'll be happy to hear from anyone here on if you have had any experience of Abilene paradoxes at work or at home. And if you're open to share about it, we can look at those Abilene paradoxes and we can see what we can do or what we could do differently to ensure that we are not really falling into this trap often. Anyone has any experience to share on the Abilene paradox? Okay, while you're thinking, I will I'll give you the story of where this Abilene paradox really came up from. This was, I think, the Abilene paradox as a concept is as old as I am, and it was published by an American professor. So the story is about a man who was living with his wife and his in-laws in Texas, and one hot sunny afternoon in July, his mother-in-law, his father-in-law actually proposed that why don't we go on a drive to Abilene and let's have a meal there. And the mother-in-law immediately said that, yes, that sounds like a good idea. Let's go. I've been wanting to go to Abilene for a long time. His wife also joins in saying, this sounds like a fantastic idea. It's a long time since we all have gone out together before. So let's go to Abilene and have a meal there. And then the son-in-law also jumps in saying, this looks like a family fun event. So let's drive to Abilene. So he drives the family of four. They drive to Abilene. It's a hot, sunny afternoon, scorching heat, dusty roads, heavy traffic, non-air conditioned vehicle. They drive all the way to Abilene. They go to the restaurant that the father-in-law was talking about. They have a meal there, and the meal wasn't so great because anyways, the weather wasn't so great for dining out either. They didn't quite enjoy the meal as much as they thought they would, and they had to drive all the way back home. On the way back, when they were nearing their house, they felt extremely tired and exhausted. And the mother-in-law said, it wasn't that great an idea to go to Abilene all the way on a sunny summer afternoon. I would have rather been at home. The wife says, I had lots of things to do at home. I was actually not too keen on going out, but I said that we'll go because I thought you all wanted to spend time together. The son-in-law says, I too neither wanted to go anywhere. I wanted to rest this weekend because I have a long week ahead, but I thought this is what you all wanted, and that's why I agreed to it. The father-in-law who had actually proposed this, he said, I thought you guys were looking forward to a family outing, and that's why I suggested Abilene because it's quite a long drive, and I thought you're going to enjoy the drive. So at the end of it, if you notice, right from the one who proposed to everyone who agreed, all of them actually did not want to go to Abilene. So the because they were all talking about taking a trip to Abilene. I'm seeing Riddhi Shah saying something. Riddhi, what's your comment? Even in today's scenario, if you're having a different opinion than the group used to treat you like an odd man, how to address or handle such a situation? Exactly. So the biggest fear that we all have in our minds is, what will people think? Log kya sochenge? Right? When you're trying to come up with your point of view, the first thought that crosses our mind is, my point of view is different. What will people think when I suggest this? Okay, there is this fear of judgment in our minds, and that's what Riddhi is saying, that people treat you like an odd man out, and you don't want to be an odd man out. So what do you do? So Riddhi, it's not very simple for each one of us to fight this battle alone. And that's why I'm saying it's important for managers and leaders to set psychological safety in teams so that people slowly eliminate this fear of judgment or fear of consequence or fear of failure of being taken, being accepted, right? So it starts from the top. How do you build a culture of psychological safety? It starts from there. So as managers, if we start encouraging people to give their individual opinions, I think it's important for us to make that conscious effort and tell people, I want to hear your viewpoint. Even if it is contradictory, it is important that I hear viewpoint. I hear your viewpoint, right? So it starts with the managers, it starts top down with managers encouraging people to have a different viewpoint than what is being presented. Now, once having said that, it's also important to be consistent with it. So when you're talking of a culture of psychological safety, it is not something that happens overnight. And it's not something that just gets built just like that. You cannot say that it is psychologically safe. Rome was not built in a day, and so was psychological safety. It doesn't get built in a day. So managers have to consistently demonstrate that they are not judgmental, and there is no need for a fear of consequence or a fear of judgment or a fear of failure. Now, as individuals, what can we do to ensure that we don't fall into this Abilene paradox trap is that in a very polite manner, but a firm manner, try to make an attempt to place your point of view, but thoroughly backed up by data, by insights, etc. Whenever there is a situation where you have to conform to whoever is there, be part of the group, or feel that you're part of the group, you will notice that there is a possibility of a conflict between conformity and conviction. Conviction is what you truly believe from inside. When you notice that there is a conflict between conformity and conviction, that's where you know that you're likely to fall in the Abilene paradox trap. And to prevent, it's not just yourself falling into that trap, but to prevent an organizational decision from going wrong, it's important that you speak out what your conviction is. There's nothing wrong in speaking it out. There was one of my bosses used to tell me that it's okay to say, this is my opinion, my viewpoint, because of the following reasons. I have a rationale to it, and this is my conviction, this is my viewpoint. You may be in a position of authority higher than me, because of which you drive home a decision. I'm okay with that. But still, I want you to listen to my viewpoint. So this is an example of how you put it forward politely but firmly and speak with conviction. If you do that, you're not forcing them to take your stand, right? You're not trying to, at this point, you're not trying to convert them to agree with what you're saying. But all that you can do is at least let the group know that here is someone with a slightly different thought. Here is someone who is willing to talk a different language. It will stimulate others also to think differently. Now, when you keep doing this, provided you're speaking with conviction, you can't do it just for the sake of arguing. That's not fair anyways. If you keep doing this consistently, you will notice that people are slowly able to accept you as someone who comes up with disruptive solutions. So you have to start small, and you have to be consistent. You have to start, it's better if we start from the top, so that it gets driven as a culture. So at least in your circle of influence, wherever you can drive this psychological safety downwards, ensure that you do. Thank you so much for bringing this up, Riddhi. We had a good, it was something that triggered a thought in my mind as well. Anyone else, would you want to share any experiences around the Abilene paradox? I would love to hear some voices. Sandeep?
Hello.
Yes. Yes, Sandeep.
Good evening, ma'am. I have a query that in certain groups, there are some people who are very intelligent and you want them to suggest an idea. Suppose a decision is there, which is actually not going to help entire group. There are certain people who want to stay silent and they don't want to speak, but whenever they speak, they can actually benefit the group. Now, how you can convince as a manager, how you will convince that that person should speak? He has a habit of not speaking, even when prompted. Maybe he's not comfortable, he doesn't want to speak, but if he speaks, it will be beneficial. And that decision, entire decision which has been would change if now he prefers to be silent. Now what to do?
Yeah, so there are ways to do it. So I'll give you two situations in which such people you can deal with and get the best out of them. One is if you have to brainstorm something, right? You're not, so when you have to brainstorm something, you have a problem statement and you are brainstorming in a group of people where this silent person is also there. And normally when we brainstorm, what do? We put the problem statement on a board and we open it out to people, and people give a lot of ideas or solutions, and that's called open brainstorming. So in an open brainstorming, what happens? This kind of person that you just described will be quiet. Even though he or she might have the best of the ideas, will prefer to keep quiet because that's his or her nature, doesn't want to come forward and speak up, right? So the ideas that are there in this person's mind will never reach the table. So how do you avoid that, right? Or how do you make that person speak? Is yeah, because here when disruptive ideas are not coming, so how do you prevent that? In a brainstorming situation, use a brainstorming method where anonymity is maintained. That will help you prevent falling into the Abeline paradox trap, because when anonymity is maintained and you're constantly reiterating that anonymity is maintained, okay, there are brainstorming tools like the affinity or cluster diagram. There is another brainstorming tool called as bullseye. There is another brainstorming tool called snowballing. Now, in these brainstorming methods, everyone's idea gets to the table and it gets discussed without pointing out who is the source of that idea. So you can use any of these when you have such people in your group, when you're doing brainstorming. When you're doing a group discussion, okay, and you know that this person could have the best of the ideas, but will not speak even when prompted, a prompting alone may not be enough. You probably have to ask, you can, if it's a small group, you can go around the table, and one of the conditions in the social contract before that meeting starts could be that everyone in this table has to share their viewpoint with the pros and cons. Right? So if you say everyone has to share their viewpoint with the pros and cons, it means you're asking for everyone's solutions or viewpoint with the advantages and disadvantage. So no one has the authority to say that my idea is the best idea, or no one has the privilege to keep quiet. Because when you have shy people in the group, even if you prompt them, they're so shy that that prompting will again push them back into the shell. Like you said, they won't come out with it even if they're prompted. So keep a fair ground for everybody, equal ground for everybody. Everyone in the team in this room has to talk about their viewpoint with the pros and cons. You can do either that, or if you feel that there could be a tendency of copy paste, in the sense one person speaks and everybody says, yeah, I agree with this person, say and repeat the same thing. If you feel that is possible, then what you can do is you can ask people to write down the pros and cons of what they think the solution should be. You can ask them to write it down first, using a silent idea generation method. Ask them to write it down without reading it. First, individually write it down and then present it to the team. Then read out. Then getting influenced by each other will not happen. So there are several such methods by which you lay a fair ground to everybody in the room, so that even the shy person doesn't feel singled out because he or she is shy. Once upon a time, when I was a very timid individual, I used to hate it when the facilitator in the room or the teacher in the room used to look around the class. And I used to keep telling myself that the teacher should not look at me in the eye, because if she looks at me in the eye, she's going to call me, make me stand up. So even though I knew the right answers, I feared getting singled out. And I used to get singled out because I was the quietest in the room. But how does one break that? Is when you tell everybody in the room is equal. Everyone has to think of an answer and tell us the answer with the pros and cons. Okay, then you're giving everyone a level ground. You're not even singling out the shy person. Try that out. It should work. Dr. VLN has a question: is Abilene a short duration disappointment at psychological level more, but not much on economic loss? It depends on the situation, sir. It could be something, a short duration disappointment at psychological level in the lunch example, the lunch story. But if it is a major organizational decision, it could result in an economic loss. In the Ek Ruka Hua Faisla story, if Abilene paradox actually had way, and if the juror number 8 did not disrupt it, it could have resulted in the loss of that young individual. for murder, right? So Abeline paradox in situations could result in different kinds of losses, maybe just a psychological disappointment. It could even be an economic loss. It could even be important for us to start understanding that in a conflict between conformity and conviction, it's very important for us to sway towards conviction and not towards conformity. I'm not saying that we should end up arguing for everything or have a different opinion. But if we have a different opinion and it is driven by our conviction, it's very important for us to speak up. Otherwise, it could result in a huge loss. Anyone else wants to share any incidences from their life? I'll be happy to dissect that for you. Yeah, written suggestions is a good option. And let me give you all what happens when you write. And because I'm studying neuroscience, it keeps coming back to me is when you're talking, your brain is also, so when you're talking, your eyes are looking at people around you, right? And your ears are also listening to the crosstalk and the murmurs. You're looking at people's body language, whether people are agreeing with you or not. So your brain is constantly forming stories about what people think about what you're saying. So as you're speaking, you will tend to modulate yourself or your point of view to make the people around you happy. That's natural. Okay. So for example, when I was talking to this audience with nobody turning on the videos, I have no idea what people are thinking about what I'm talking. So I'm only talking about what I feel is right. But when Faisal turned on the video, and if Faisal has a smile on his face, I know that I still have time, I can talk. But if Faisal looks a little worried, I know that, okay, I need to cut short. So what I'm trying to say is when you're talking to an audience, you're talking to a group, you're putting forward your viewpoint, please be mindful that your brain is trying constantly to make you look good in front of others. And this is normal human behavior. You will end up modulating your viewpoint in such a way that you may not yourself agree with it 100%. Then you know that you have allowed entry for Abilene paradox to happen. But when you write silently, what happens is your eyes are only looking at the paper on which you are writing. Your brain is only focusing through your eyes on that paper on which you are writing. Your brain is not paying attention to anything else that is happening in the room. So your brain is not really perturbed by what people will think. And even for a moment, you might want to argue that your ears are still listening to murmurs in the room. But when everybody in the room on plain ground, everyone in the room is writing their individual point of views, there won't be murmurs in the room. But if you are talking your point of view, there will be others who might start murmuring because of the biases they have against you or for you, right? But when everybody in the room is on a plain ground, everyone is equal and everybody is writing their point of view on a piece of paper, your brain is focusing on what you're writing. So your brain is actually giving instructions to your hand to write your point of view. And so is everyone doing. Now, when you do that, there is very, very little likelihood of people completely agreeing with each other or doing a copy paste of what other person has said. And there is a much higher chance of disruptive individualistic ideas coming. And therefore, even when you're doing brainstorming, silent idea generation is a great way. Even if you're not doing brainstorming, if you're just doing a group discussion, when you're asking people to speak out, before you ask them to speak out, ask them to write it. It always helps. WhatsApp groups are more of conformance, and not just WhatsApp groups, sir. Anything that is published on social media, I think needs to be verified. People like to publish things which make them look good because everyone likes to be appreciated. So that's something that one needs to validate before we jump into appreciate people. And while appreciating and celebrating is a great virtue, one needs to validate whether it's people are doing things to make themselves look good. That's something become accountable for each other's authenticity. I think that's very important. Faisal, back to you.
Thank you, Ms. Harini. The session was very informative and very insightful. So before we move into the Q&A session, we will be initiating the poll. Request all the participants to kindly share your feedback. While doing so, request all the participants to kindly post their questions in the chat box. Once again, I thank all our participants for joining our session today. We have received a lot of inquiry about the e-certificate offered by HRAI. You can claim your certificate by sharing your details, name, session attended in an email to the email ID provided in the chat window. Please ensure you do this by the end of this month. We will email the e-certificates to you based on the details received.
Good to see you, Tahir. Tahir, do you want to say something?
Yeah. Do we unmute you?
Yes.
Yes, right? Yeah. Sham, request you to please.
Yeah. Yes, Tahir.
No, I joined very late. I was just there for the last 15 minutes. But it was good to hear you, as always.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
So, Ms. Harini, we have received some of the questions from our registrations. So,
Yeah, let's take them.
yeah, just take them. So the first one is Abeline paradox similar to a leadership module called shared leadership or connected leadership?
It is not exactly. Shared leadership is not a paradox, first of all. Shared leadership or connected leadership is where people put their thoughts together in an inclusive manner and come out with productive, constructive solutions. That's quite an adult to adult behavior. Abeline paradox is very much a child to child behavior. You just want to be part of the group, and therefore you recommend or you put forth something which is not even what you truly believe in. This is a very, very child to child behavior. So it's not really the same. But when you are coming up with leadership decisions, there is a possibility for Abilene paradox to creep in. That's the way it is related. But it's definitely not the same.
So we have a second question. How effective is this concept on the floor when it comes to critical decision making involving multiple stakeholders across the levels?
It's definitely effective. You have to look at it like this. What if you do not break the paradox? What are we going to be left with? It's the frustration. When I say frustration, it's not just the emotional feeling of frustration. It's not just the psychological frustration. I'm saying frustration of the loss that has happened because of that decision which you yourself did not believe in. Would that give you sleepless nights? Or would the aspect of actually voicing your point of view and have people looking at you strangely, would that give you more sleepless nights? You have to weigh the two. And therefore, instead of taking up an argument and forcing your point of view, instead of taking that extreme, the more practical way to do that is to raise your point of view if it is different. If you are not agreeing to the group thing that is happening, even if you just raise your point of view and you leave it at that, let people ruminate over it. And you step back saying, well, if the group decides against it, against what I'm saying, if the group decides against it, these are the consequences. That's what I think. But still, if the group decides against it, go forward. So what you're doing is you have just pointed out your point of view, something that is driven by your conviction. So at the end of it, even if the decision is not in favor of the organization, even if it is a wrong decision, At least the group will see that you have been credible enough to giving your point of view. And you also feel that you have done your bit. You've prevented an Abilene paradox from happening as a culture within the group. A wrong decision might have been taken because there was majority and you were in the minority. That's fine. But what you have done is you actually prevented Abilene paradox. The message you're leaving with others is, if you have a different point of view, if you have a different opinion, it's okay to voice it out. Right? So these are small things that one can do to ensure that you nip off the Abilene paradox trap even before it sets in. Once you fall into that trap, there's no coming back. You straight away go into the decision which is not acceptable to everybody, including you. And that's a much, much, much bigger frustration.
Very nicely answered, Ms. Harini. There is one question saying that what are the pros and cons of Abilene paradox? So I think
Cons are many because it is an agreement of disagreement, something that we do not wish, but we went ahead and did it, right? So obviously the cons are greater. Nobody in the group wanted to do it, but we went ahead and did it. So obviously it was a pathetic decision that the group took. So I don't have to say anything about the cons. Pros of Abilene paradox, I don't know, except the fact that you momentarily see some unanimity in the group. Except that, I don't think there is a long-standing pro of Abilene paradox. It looks like the group is together, but for the moment. The outcome is not something which is beneficial to anybody. But for the moment, it looks like the group is together. It's a very, very, very small pro. But let's leave for the moment for a while. And it's not always good to be to look at things which look good for the moment when you're talking business. Look at the long-term consequence. If everybody starts being together only for the moment, you're completely eliminating their ability to dream big and to think in the future. So Abilene paradox, while it looks like the group seems to be happy and together for the moment, it is actually eliminating that group's ability to look at the future and think beyond the moment. Now look at it, whether you want to just loathe in that momentary feeling of oneness, or you want to take that oneness to drive the business forward. That's the choice you have to make. So pros and cons, very hard to say. I can't see any real pros.
Thank you. So, although you have shared few stories, there is one question saying that can you please share few stories or maybe anecdotes where such concept was practically used and the kind of results it has achieved?
Yeah, of course. One was the famous story of trip to Abilene, which is very much there on internet. That is something that I shared. I also shared my experience of choosing a wrong restaurant. Now, they are real examples though, but these are not work situations. The Anamika story was a work situation where a decision about working hours was taken, which nobody really agreed, and we had to roll back that decision. So there are many such situations in the workplace which one can think about. I think there's another one I can tell you a practical situation, and here is where the Abilene paradox was actually avoided. So I'll talk to you about that. So there was so it was part of an Indian entity, part of a global organization, and there was discussions about standardization of job titles. This was a huge exercise because the Indian entity had very fancy job titles, whereas the global organization had fewer designations, flatter structures, and not so fancy job titles. So if you have to standardize all of this, you have to stop calling, you'll have to stop things like general manager, senior general manager, joint general manager, and things like that. And you have to say that there's only one general manager. So what happened is somebody who had progressed from a joint general manager to a general manager, you're saying that there is no such thing as a joint general manager, so it's only a general manager designation, he's okay. But someone has become a senior general manager, okay? Now you're saying there is no such thing as a senior general manager and we'll call you general manager. So although it is not a downgrade, really, there is no change in salary, there is no downward displacement in any benefit, nothing. It's just that a title is looking less fancy, right? So when you have to take a decision like this, we did this in one organization, we had to standardize so that globally we are looked at the way so the job title should actually be descriptive of the job content. So when I was discussing this with all my heads of departments, because global offices were asking us for a standardization, people said that, oh yes, we have to do it. There is no other way out. We will talk to people. We will have to convince them. So people were actually saying we will have to convince them. They didn't say that, yes, we are convinced, we'll do all the talking. See the difference. So when I noticed that people were agreeing to it because it was being imposed or being globally driven, but in the heart of hearts, they felt that it's not easy to convince people about designation changes. We will have to convince them. So there is a feeling of apprehension in their tone. So I noticed that an Abeline paradox is beginning to show its face here when everybody is conforming to something, even though it is conflicting with their conviction. So, and then I started to have one-on-one conversations with them, not to understand why they said so, but to understand from them what are the pros and cons of driving this exercise globally in India also. Some of them came up with some very funny, very bizarre cons as well, but they did they did give their voice out. And then we put that up to our global authorities and we said that there are certain psychological aspects to this. So it may not be meaningful for us to bulldoze this down our people. We'll have to do it in a slightly different way. We'll have to do it in a subtle manner. So as people are progressing in levels, we will have to do the subtle change and we will have to live with some of those abnormal designations for some time. So we worked that out and it was a lot more easier for us to handle. So if I had not noticed the Abilene paradox setting in there, if I had gone purely by saying that we will have to convince people to do it, I would have had all those HODs going and telling people that I tried to stop it, but it was imposed by global. So imagine what would have happened to the morale of the employees. People would have gone back feeling there is something that is being imposed on us, even though our managers don't believe it. So there's a complete communication loss and wrong messaging that happens top down and bottom up. And this is another example that I've actually encountered.
Yeah, very, very good example, Ms. Harini. So thank you, Ms. Harini, for this insightful and intriguing session. Your knowledge on this topic was phenomenal. It's been a pleasure being with you today. I'm sure our participants had a lot to learn and take away from this session. Before we conclude with today's session, we would also want to thank the association members, Geisha, NASCOM COE, LinkedIn Local, Talgro, TLE, and WICCI for supporting these HRAI events. To know more about these associations, request you to kindly visit the link provided in the chat window. Thank you once again, dear speaker and our participants for joining us today. Do join us for our next masterclass by Mr. Avilo Roy, Managing Director, Kolkata Ventures, on the topic Employee to Entrepreneur, tomorrow, 27th of July, 2022. That's it from our today's webinar. See you soon. Stay safe, take care, and bye for now. Thank you, Ms. Harini.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.